Let me welcome everybody. Let me welcome you to this week's Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm the forum's creator, host, and chief cat herder. I'm very glad to see you here today for an extraordinary session. Now, before we begin, let me take a few minutes to introduce the forum. Let me explain how it works and where it came from, and then we'll start with this week's guest. So to begin with, you should know that the forum is entirely about conversation. What I'm doing right now with showing you a slide is something that we do only for a minute to begin the show. Otherwise, we are entirely about exchanges and conversation between people, between myself, our guests, and all of you. Now, this discussion-based idea is a spin-off. It comes out of the monthly trends analysis project called the Future Trends in Technology and Education Report. This has been going on for almost a decade now. It's a monthly report that takes a look at the major trends reshaping education and technology. If you haven't seen it, just go to ftte.us and you can download a few sample issues and subscribe if you like. Now, the forum and the FTTE report are part of a broader project called the Future of Education Observatory. Now, this is an interdisciplinary, ongoing, open, multimedia effort to try to grapple with where education is headed. It includes the forum, it includes the FTTE report, it also includes a blog, a book club, and a bookstore, and some other features coming up. If you haven't seen it, just go to futureofeducation.us and you can learn more. Now, we can only do this work with the help of some very generous supporters, and we'd like to thank them before we proceed. To begin with, I'd like to thank NYSERNet from New York State. This is a nonprofit that helps that state's colleges and universities get onto broadband networks and do great work with each other. They do fantastic projects at NYSERNet. Their NYSCIO event, their annual conference, is terrific, and I'm really grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to Shindig because, as you can tell, they make available the technology we're using right now. So let me just take you through that if you haven't had a chance to use it before, or if you haven't seen it for a while. Now, the screen has a few different parts. Where I am and where this slide is just for a minute is called the stage. And it's called that because everyone can see and hear everything that goes on stage. This is where our guest is going to be in just a minute. And this is where you can be if you like. Now, below us, you can see around you a bunch of different people. You can see different logins. Some of them might be video feeds, like from Tom Hames. Some of them might be silhouettes, like Lisa Durf. Each one of those represents one sign-in, usually one person, sometimes a few people around a table. Now, if you'd like to talk to somebody else who signed in, you can just double-click on their icon. And if they want to talk to you, your two icons can click together like Legos, and you can have your own private audiovisual bubble, which is pretty neat. Now, how do you participate in all of our conversations? Well, there are a lot of ways. First of all, by listening and watching, there's that. But how do you contribute? How do you push back? How do you offer comments or questions? You have three ways. Look at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a white strip running along it. On the left edge are three buttons, which are crucial. So on the leftmost edge, you'll see a button with a number. Right now it's the number 16. And you'll see a little syllable underneath that. If you click that, up will pop two different windows. So the window on the left will give you a film strip view of all the different participants right now. And on the right is a chat box where you can type in comments, questions, URLs, jokes, or thoughts as you go. And we find that people often use that for informal commentary, for quickly sharing links that came up. And that's one way to participate with the roughly 16 people who come in with you in this conversation. Now, you close that, go back to that white strip, you'll see a second button. And the second button is a question mark with a circle around it. If you press that, up will pop a little box into which you can type in a comment or a question. And when the time is right, I can read that out loud so everyone can hear it, and I'll flash it on the screen so everyone can see it. Now, next to the question mark is a raised hand button. If you press that, that tells us that you want to join us up here on stage. So if your camera is working, your microphone is working, and if you're in a space like I am where you can speak freely out loud, perfect. You can just press that button. When the time is right, we'll beam you up on stage. In fact, we can have up to 4 people up here at one time. So there can be myself, our guest, and 2 participants having a kind of pop-up panel of conversation. So through the video, through the chat, through the text, those are 3 different ways you can participate in this conversation. If that's not enough, if you're a Twitter user, head over to Twitter and use the hashtag FTTE. And people there will often ask questions or comments, sometimes if they can't make it here for bandwidth reasons or if they're traveling. But we've already had several people push out some thoughts and ideas. you can use that. Just use the hashtag FTTE. Or if you like, tweet at myself, Brian Alexander. So those are different ways to participate. All of those are ways that you can share your thoughts and respond to this week's guest in our conversation. We're really grateful to Shindig for making all the technology available. We're also grateful to our supporters on Patreon. And if you haven't seen Patreon, it's a crowdfunding site like Kickstarter or GoFundMe. It lets you collaboratively support some creative project that you like. In this case, it's our project of exploring the future of education and technology. So people contribute as little as $1 a month to make sure that all the machines are running. I'm really grateful to the more than 110 people who are on there right now. If you look at the screen here, you can see there are some wonderful people who we really want to thank. Folks like Matthew Henry, Bob Johnson, Michael Haggins, Chris Lott, Corey S., people who contribute, and we really appreciate that. We're grateful to them for everything that they do. Thank you. And if you want to join them, just go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander. Now, that is how this is supported. That's how the forum works. That's where it came from. Now, let me introduce this week's guest. I'm delighted to introduce a truly extraordinary person, Kevin deLaPlante. He's the founder and lead instructor of the Critical Thinker Academy. He used to be a tenured professor at a university teaching philosophy, and he gave up that powerful classic position in order to teach online, entirely online, and teach people how to be critical thinkers. So we are very, very excited to see him, and we're really looking forward to the conversation. So let me just bring him up right now. Let me find where he is. And let me add him to our discussion. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you.
Thank you. I apologize. When we did the pre-setup here for some connectivity issues, so I hope they've been resolved as much as we can.
Well, so far you look good and your sound is excellent.
That's good. Thank you. Super. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, me too. So let me just ask to get things started. First of all, where are you today?
I'm in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada.
Nice.
It's the capital city of Canada. I grew up here. I did my undergrad here in physics at Carleton University. Then I went to grad school at Western Ontario, which is in London, Ontario.
Sure.
And then I ended up, for the duration of my academic career, was down in the United States in the middle of Iowa. And I was there for 16 years, Iowa State University.
Sure.
So I was in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies in Iowa for 16 years. And I only moved back to Ottawa, my hometown, in 2015.
So you're one of those insidious Canadian invaders who are trying to subvert American culture.
That's right.
Excellent.
Happy to say so.
I know. Well, I'm delighted to host you for all kinds of reasons, not just because I'm one of those Americans who loves Canada. And full disclosure, my wife has Canadian citizenship, so we crossed the border, and they let her carry over machine guns and crack. But
that's right.
But this is the forum is a very international platform, and so we're glad to welcome people even from the Maple Menace. One of the reasons I was so excited to invite you is because of your truly extraordinary career path. As a professor, as someone with a PhD, you landed that coveted position of tenured faculty member, and yet you gave that all up so that you could start an entirely online teaching program. Now, you must be asked this probably every 36 hours. What does that transition look like right now on reflection? What do you make of this shocking and unusual career trajectory?
Oh, well, I'm super grateful for it. It's a remarkable time because of the technology that enables this, that would make it possible, is really only within the last 10, 15 years. Right? It would have been hard to do this. I mean, you can leave anytime. People can leave academia anytime. They go off and do things. They go into business or whatnot. But being able to take what you love doing in your career, in your academic training, let's say it's biology or art history or Greek philosophy or whatever, and think that you could train for that within the academic context, and generally most jobs would be in that environment, And then imagine that I could take that and teach that outside of an academic environment and maybe make a living doing it, is a modern thing. And doing it from home, from your own, so that allows you to be mobile as well. If I wanted to move from Ottawa to Toronto, from Ottawa to
Mm,
Halifax, or
mm,
from or back to the States, I could, and it wouldn't affect
right.
the nature of the business that I'm doing.
It's not geolocated. You could
It's
move
not
to.
it's not geolocated, and that was one of the real attractions for me going, starting way back. I mean, the short answer to the question of how I made the decision, or when I made the decision, was I made the decision when I was convinced there was a viable path forward.
Mm,
The longer answer is that I had decided in grad school that my tenure as an academic would be finite.
mm,
So when I was 27, 28 years old, and I was in the midst of my PhD program, um, and I would tell people, I said, I think I'm going to do this for about 10 years. And then I'm going to transition out. I'm going to find some way to do like public education, public philosophy, public engagement, something
mm.
that would allow me to, because that was really the driving goal. So when I was a kid, I was really inspired by people like Carl Sagan,
Yeah.
watching
Yeah.
the Cosmos series back in 1980, or whenever that
Mm-hmm.
was,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking, oh, here's a scientist, and he's an academic, but he's also a public educator, and he's using
Right.
his voice to create, and these marvelous, television, multimedia technology to create these learning experiences, inspirational learning experiences, which really touched me. And I thought, wow, wouldn't that be a cool thing to do? And the question was sort of how to do that. I mean, I had the idea in mind of transitioning out, but the form in which this would take was still open. So back in the day when I was a graduate student, I was a cartoonist, sort of amateur cartoonist. And I thought,
Yeah.
okay, maybe I'll do like educational cartooning. So the transition would be after year 10 or so, I would go and I would be like doing these like cartooning projects on the side,
Mm,
developing, and then maybe you develop an audience, and maybe you have a book or two that comes out, and then all of a sudden, maybe you can make it a go of it like that, a transition out. Um,
yeah.
but what happened in the interim was the rise of online video teaching and training, and the Flash animation revolution that happened in
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
early mid 2000s, and YouTube happened, and so the parameters changed really, and the other important thing is that universities, colleges, and universities, they didn't get behind their faculty doing cartooning, right? That
Right.
wasn't the thing. They got
Right.
behind online education.
Mm-hmm.
That was an economically important movement for them. This sea change that was going to transform higher ed meant that they were looking for people who could develop some skills in this area to be able to deliver online courses. And they were converting the distance education programs into online education programs. And so all of a sudden now I could say, oh, this is something that they want to encourage me to learn. So the university starts giving all these workshops
Mm-hmm.
on how to use Adobe products, and how to do a screencast, and
Mm-hmm.
what is a podcast, and this was before the more modern period when the stuff is rather ubiquitous. This is before YouTube, and so I took advantage of those, and so it was the natural pathways means I started producing recorded videos based on the lecture content that I was doing in my classes, and rationalize that as a kind of flipped class model, right? Where
Okay.
you could put your videos up on WebCT or Blackboard or whatever
Mm-hmm.
those
LMSs.
classroom management systems you're using, and then you could say, rather than do this can't lecture for the 8 millionth time the way I always do it, like a stand-up comic always does the joke the same way, right? You can sort of preserve a version of that, and then students can access it whenever they want on their own time. So you don't have to repeat the same thing,
Classic flipped
and
classroom.
then you can. you can change up what you do, how you spend your time in the classroom. So that was a very reasonable model. And the byproduct of that model is that I sort of leaned into it and I started to accumulate this library of videos based on course content I was doing. And that was really the sort of beginning of that plus seeing sort of down the road a little ways about where might this go in the next couple of years if I sort of if I
Mm-hmm.
keep this up, when
Mm-hmm.
you have accumulated a certain sort of critical mass of content,
Mm-hmm.
is it not also valuable not just for my students, but people outside the university system?
So this is let me pause you there for a sec. Um, because you're describing the time that so many of us live through. You're describing the changes in university strategy, the developments in technology that we're all to different degrees familiar with or experienced. But this led you, instead of staying within the university, to bolt out and actually create something brand new. Before I finish that thought, let me just ask everybody if you would like to ask questions about this, and I'm sure you're going to have plenty of questions. Please use any of the means that we mentioned before. If your mic and camera are working and you want to join us up on stage, I promise we're very, very friendly and it's easy to beam you up. If you'd like to ask a question by text because you can't join us on stage, just hit the question button and I'll start queuing those up. So I have to ask, everything you've described, Kevin, to me sounds like a great description of a professor who would want to expand their teaching while retaining their faculty base. You know, you think of a faculty who create enormous online presences but still teach, someone like Curtis Bonk, for example, or Eric Rabkin at the University of Michigan. But instead, you said you're going to cut yourself off from the enormous base of support. You're going to remove yourself from the security of tenure. Instead, you're going to completely set up shop in the wilderness, completely on your own, DIY, and recreate an entire teaching environment with the story name of Academy. What led you to that decision?
Um, the decision to go full bore out, to sort of
Yeah,
cut
yeah,
ties.
yeah.
Um, you know, there might have been other paths that where the story would have been different. If we had lived in a part of the country that we imagined wanting, my wife and I family wanted to settle down permanently, that
Mm,
might have been
mm,
made a difference.
mm-hmm,
If I could have done something like teach 2 or 3 days a week, and then the other 2 or 3 days a week, do something more creative,
mm,
like,
mm.
producing videos or other
Cartoons.
content or cartoons or and so on, and doing more public, if that was an easy path to move into, and I saw people doing this. This is not it is rare, but I was paying attention to people who in the field who were doing it. For example, Jay Hostler. Jay Hostler is a biologist from
He's a
Juniata
wonderful
College.
guy. Wonderful guy.
Right. So, he's been able to balance his career as an academic teacher, biologist, and researcher, and professional cartoonist doing science educational cartoons.
Let me just put in a plug for at least two of Jay's volumes. So he has a book called Clan Apis, which is a fantastic, fantastic look into bees. And he also has a wonderful book on Darwin called, I think it's the Sandwalk Diaries,
Yeah,
which is a great, great look at Darwin's philosophy. And these are terrific cartoons, really, really accessible while he's teaching a 4-4 load at Juniata. And a tremendous, tremendous person. So
that's
that was
right.
another model for you. But you went somewhere else, though.
Well,
You just,
one of the issues with someone uh, like Jay is that he was at an institution that embraced it. Now, it's worth knowing he's at a college, small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania that
right.
doesn't have more than 2,000 students. So
Mhm.
teaching is the prime directive for faculty at this institution. And so someone who's teaching is expanding the domains of teaching skill set, doing this stuff with outreach and comics and so on is part of that culture in a very strong way. So he gets rewarded at Juniata for doing this. But if he was at a research one university
I see what you mean.
with a department that was competitive, he
Yeah,
would not get rewarded for this. He would he would be squeezed out of the
pretty
research-oriented
quickly.
tenure track, either he would not get tenure or not be promoted from associate to full, or there would cause internal squabbling among the faculty about him pulling his load or not getting he should be teaching more because he's just a teacher now and so on. So there is this friction. And the institutions as a whole, if you're a research one university, faculty who go out and do public outreach, faculty who go out and do, cool things in the public domain, they help in some respects with the reputation of university, but in other respects, if there was a migration of people doing this, it would be disastrous for them. It upsets
Hmm.
their entire business model, right? At
Hmm.
least the academic peer reputation model, where grants and and awards are the basis of sort of are um, the currency of higher education in a top art in a research oriented program. So the career path for someone who wants to be, taken seriously as a researcher in your field, that's where there's a real problem. The place where I see where there's enormous opportunity are for someone like in the sort of lecturer class, the adjunct class, who's
Hmm.
already got a heavy teaching load,
Mm.
and they wanted to find ways to um, expand their audience and exploit more opportunities for revenue and income and opportunity for creative outlet. That would be it's just wide open for them. It's also wide open for smaller liberal arts colleges where there's a teaching focus and you have and it's in there in that environment too. I think the faculty have an opportunity to take advantage of this, and the institution would um, support it. But otherwise, I think it's a hard sell. It's a hard
I
sell.
see what you mean. I see what you mean. So this is what you've described as a kind of alternative pathway for someone who wants to teach and teach creatively, and to teach beyond the immediate confines of a registrar-based class. Um, Again, friends, I want to make sure that you have a chance to ask questions, and I've got a couple of annoying questions to ask, but I'm sure you'll have more thoughtful ones. And I'd like to hear as well from your experience, if this is a path that you've considered or that somebody else you know has pursued, or what you think about this. I mean, are we seeing Kevin blazing the path for what will become another mainstream way for faculty and researchers and teachers to work in the rest of the 21st century? So, practical question I've got to ask is, how do you support all this? I mean, do you use advertising? Is Patreon your main income? Have you made a deal with the devil? I mean, how do you keep the wolf from the door?
Well, the story for me right now is going to be familiar to people who are like lecturers and adjuncts, in the sense that there's a lot of people in that job um, cobble together income from a number of different we're teaching classes for a number of different institutions, maybe
Right.
some local colleges, some online stuff, and over the course of their year, they add up. They are able to accumulate a certain number of courses, but it's kind of it's a pie wedge with several different
Mm, mm,
sources going in. In my case, it's not quite like that because I don't really teach in, although this summer, for example, I did teach an in-class summer class at Carleton University. I taught the philosophy of science course for 6
mm.
weeks at Carleton. It's the
In
second time
person,
I've done that
face to
in
face, in the
person,
physical classroom.
face to face. I was also developing an online course on the vocabulary of science, which is
Mm,
basically a version of like an intro to the philosophy of science, the way that I have taught it in the
mm,
past, and
mm.
so it sort of dovetailed in some sense with the content that I was developing there at that time. But in general, though, one part of it comes from the Critical Thinker Academy website, which is largely like a monthly subscription thing where people can log in and they sign up and they pay $3 a month or $5 a month, and they get access to all this video content. Um,
So the video is
so
paywalled.
so the videos are, well, a certain subset of them. It's not
Hmm.
all free.
Hmm.
I've experimented with free. I've experimented with lots of different models and mixed models in the past. So all the stuff on on YouTube is free. Obviously, I have a podcast. The podcast content is free. Several of the courses at their Academy site are free. Um, but there's this other level which is paywall, so that's a source. Patreon is which is
Hmm.
the as your audience knows, a recurring. That's been something I've been um, has is a slice. Um, I kind of advertise that as so the podcast is a is the free content, and it spend a lot of hours on that, and so it helps to support the sort of the public thing, but also the my goal really is I do have a public education mandate in the sense that I think the critical thinking skills, unlike say Photoshop skills or how to bake a pie skills, they're great to have, but they're not necessarily a public good in the way that
Hmm.
basic education is a public good, basic healthcare, basic, there's others. Um, I do think that, there's an argument to be made that in a liberal democratic culture in the 21st century, uh, we're all better off if more people have the opportunity to develop critical thinking skills, reasoning skills, persuasion and communication skills that are sort of fundamental to sort of democratic citizenship and participation in a democratic culture that that we should treat it as a public good. And so, in some sense, I make that case, and some people do support me as a way of saying, if you realize your goals and what you would like to achieve, a lot more stuff that I produce would be free. And the answer is yes, it would be. So by helping to support me on a monthly basis, you help to not only maintain the stuff that is free, but also move more of the content into the free category. So in that sense, there's a kind of civic mission, you
Interesting.
can get behind, which you can't really do if you're teaching, Photoshop or some other, LinkedIn business skill or something.
Do you, uh, friends? I've got a whole. I'm very, very curious about this, and I have all kinds of questions. And again, before we go, we're going to think about this in the future sense. Um, but I have to wonder, where do most of your learners, customers, clients come from? Are they mostly from, say, within 50 kilometers of Ottawa, or are they global, or do you have a large Iowa-based contingency? Where's most of your audience?
It's mostly distributed in the US and Canada. Um, but because it's the internet. So if you have a podcast, if someone is searching through and they stumble upon, so the podcast I have now is called the Argument Ninja Podcast. Um, and there's like 35 episodes of that up there. So if you're stumbling through your podcast, wherever you are in the world, you might stumble upon that and be curious and find out about it from there. Or if you're on YouTube and you search for something about tribalism and polarization, one of my videos is probably going to pop up there. I have some popular videos that are just on essay writing, so that tends to get a certain kind of attraction there. So people learn about you from these diverse channels. The channels are globally distributed. Um, the ones who so some will become followers on a particular channel, but that's as far as they go. Others only know about you from the podcast and don't even know that you have this other site, these other assets, unless they sort of follow, attentively, as it were. They sort of know all the links and the things. Uh, uh, so it's the audience is international, and certain types of people come from different. I think I have people who are attracted in one of five different tracks. There's people who are sort of naturally philosophically inclined. They're like they're attracted to whatever philosophical content there might be in here, an opportunity to sort of engage issues at that level. There are people who are like scientifically oriented,
Hmm.
and like critical the relationship between critical thinking, scientific reasoning, and rationality, right? So there's a whole sort of a number of subcultures who are into questioning beliefs, and they might be part of the scientific rationalist movement, which is tries to get
Hmm. Hmm.
um, you know religious and other sorts of non empirically based yeah, effects out of the public square.
Well,
Um,
that's interesting.
or you got people who I think there's a there's a group of the type of people who are like analysts who naturally they want to get a perspective, like why is the country doing what it's doing now, or what's the source of this conflict, or what's the root cause of X or Y. And so they're trying to understand something having to do with like the social cultural environment that we're in, and a certain amount of the content that I do speaks to that as well. And then I think there's a category of like I call them butterflies who
Mm.
often come from an environment. Their background is maybe a little bit repressive. It could be a conservative environment, a religious environment. It could be a cult. There's a number of like ex Scientologists amongst my
Mm.
audience,
Mm.
or people who I you know guy who emailed me and said he's in a part of a very Orthodox Jewish community in New York State. They generally aren't allowed to watch TV and all that
Mhm.
stuff, but he's very concerned about his children. He's made his
Mm.
bed with this community, but he wants a way out for his kids, but he can't talk about this, right? In a public way. So sort of the website and the podcast are things he follows, and so he's trying to find a window outward into a world that has up until now been sort of shuttered. And so there's this contingent of people who are often emerge from these environments, childhood environments or adult environments, and it's like I just dropped everything I used to believe, and I don't know
Mm.
what the
Mm.
next step is. Like a butterfly who's just pulled out of that cocoon, right? And the legs are trembling, and the bird, it's like, what's the next step? And so these are the people who are often attracted to so-called critical thinking, that label,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it invites them to do the work of reconstruction, right? Which is very
Mm.
difficult because none of us reconstruct the foundations of our beliefs, from whole cloth. It's always piecemeal. But when someone
Yeah.
has a kind of more or less radical disruption, then they are looking for resources and community to help with them with that process. I think that there's a, a contingent of my audience who comes out of that group as well.
This is fascinating. I mean, and I love the way that you're responding to so many different currents in the world. I want to follow up on that, but we have our first question from the wonderful Kisa Johnson, who asks a content question. How is critical thinking and creative thinking aligned from your viewpoint? Are they similar, separate, or do they go hand in hand?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I've had people who've emailed me and been worried that if they pursue critical thinking as some kind of set of goals or tools, somehow that will stymie or stifle creative thinking, as though there was
Mm.
something antithetical or
Mm.
opposing. And my
Mm.
response is that couldn't be further from the truth. But you can understand why there's sort of a conventional, stereotype of critical thinking that emphasizes logic and rationality. So if your Spock figure,
Right.
is who you think of as someone who's sort of hyper rational, then you think, oh, they're not as in touch with their emotions, their creative side, and so on. But that's not the reality at all. Um, I used to have these 5 pillars that I would use to describe the range of the skill sets, the competencies that are important for a well-rounded critical thinker. And I would have logic and argumentation as the first two,
Okay.
which are part of the reasoning things. But then the third one is background knowledge. It's what you actually know
Mm.
about the world in terms of, what's the subject matter? Do you know the domain of which you're supposed to be thinking about? Because if you're ignorant about the topic, all the logic in the world is not going to help you overcome basic ignorance. So you need background knowledge on the questions of which you have some interest. And then
Okay.
the fourth category is rhetoric.
Hmm.
Rhetoric is the art of persuasive speech. And the synthesis of argumentation and rhetoric, or argumentation and persuasion, is part of the, I think, what is a sort of unique emphasis of my approach, is that I bring these things together very, very closely. But the fifth one I called it character or attitudes and values. And that has to do with your orientation towards certain kinds of values. Like, you have to care about the truth. It's one thing to be able to follow an argument and construct an argument, but if you don't care about the truth,
Mm.
or if you don't care about a certain kind of objectivity, if you're willing to lie, in order to be persuasive. Or if you're not concerned about self-deception, those sort of metacognitive skills about self-reflection, about humility, about calibrating your degree of confidence with the objective degree of knowledge that you have about the thing. All that stuff is actually quite hard. And it requires a certain set of attitudes and values. I call it character. And that was where my five pillars of critical thinking. And then after a while, because of conversations and stuff I knew was true, I added a sixth one, which was creativity. It was my sixth
Mhm.
pillar.
Oh, I see.
So this capacity, this is right. I hope that the story wasn't too long winded there, but the capacity to think about problems, think of problems outside the box, right? To um, combine ideas and concepts in original ways is not only a useful skill for creative work; it's an essential skill, but also for thinking skills. It's a way um, broadening one's understanding of the world and yourself. Because one of the most common problems that one of problems facing good thinking is the sort of narrowness of focus. You sort of always see the same thing the same way. You apply the same tool set, conceptual toolkit, or worldview, and if you everything in your toolkit looks like a hammer, then the world looks like a bunch of
Exactly.
nails, right?
Exactly.
So so um, I think of creativity as fundamental to a certain kind of critical thinking intelligence. But I do think that this as like an equalizer where you've got these different channels. So some people can be strong in one area but not so strong in others.
I mean,
And that's perfectly
equalizer
normal,
in the sense of
right?
music technology.
Right, right. So you can imagine someone who's um, a good you would think of them as a good critical thinker, but they're not. People can be good in different ways. Just as there can be good people can be good parents in different ways. Not everyone is a good parent in the same way, or a good scientist in the same way, or a good athlete in the same way, right? There's
Yeah.
a spectrum of excellences that on which people can have a style, like a cognitive style or a performative style. And I think there's a role for a certain kind of sort of niche critical thinker whose superpower is the way that they harness creativity, right? In a way
Mhm.
that some others are less adept at.
Well, that sounds like Kisa, actually, from what I know of her, because Kisa is extraordinary. She had a quick question to follow up. For the pillars, after logic, argument, rhetoric, and context, which one was the fourth pillar? Was that context?
I said logic, argumentation, rhetoric, background knowledge,
Background knowledge.
and attitudes and values or character, if you want to call it that.
Thanks. Thanks. And
And
we
then
had
the
another
sixth one is
and,
creativity.
and creativity. Thank you. That's a Kisa. Those are a fantastic question, and Kevin, that's a very very rich answer. Um, we had a question from another longtime friend of the program, from Tom Hames, who is interested about: have you discovered a model for the journeyman academic? I mean, is this a way forward for people who aren't necessarily tenured, don't necessarily have those resources, but are just starting out? I mean, is this an apprenticeship path?
It could be. It could be. Um, one of it is a hard one because when you're starting out, if you're let's say you're an undergrad student and you imagine a path forward, like I don't know if I'm really a person of ideas. I want to pursue this, but I don't want if I want to go the route of being a professional academic. Do I need a PhD? Maybe I do. It really depends on what your goals are, right? Certainly true that there are certain things open up to you. The farther you go along a conventional academic path, you are those do open up opportunities, both in terms of the background skill set that you develop over time and the knowledge base that you acquire, but also the way other people perceive you. Certainly true that having a PhD versus not makes a difference to people. If you're in the public sphere and you're producing content that is educational in nature, people are going to ask, "Well, why are you in a position to be authoritative on this?" Right? So, and even if the reality is, as we all know, that the way you become authoritative isn't through your PhD, unless it's in very narrowly in the field. But most of the stuff write about, have worked on over the years is not stuff that I, you know, was taught to me during a PhD program, but stuff I've learned using tools and skill sets that I learned as part of my training. Um,
That took
but
time.
what's that?
That took time.
That took time. That took time. So one of the reasons that I'm not in a position, I'm a kind of a unique position because very few people do what I do and transition as late in the game as I did. Because there are a lot of people who start grad school and then for some reason they have an experience of like this is not for me, and then they pivot out before they finish. And then there's a group of people who finish the PhD and get work as an adjunct or a lecturer or a postdoc and have a couple of years in that career, and maybe it feels like their their chances of getting a tenure track job are increasingly small, and then they pivot out. And then there's people who get in and get the tenure track job, and they've got the 5 years to get tenure, and they're overwhelmed by that experience.
Sure.
Right? And they may pivot out before that because they see the writing on the wall for them, or they realize this lifestyle is not for me. I see another opportunity path. So you can pop out at different places. Very few people stay in the game for 15 years and then pivot out, right? Like if you're beyond a certain threshold, you typically stay for good. But one of the advantages of having been in it for 15 years is I was able to have the experience of teaching for 15 years, of researching and writing for 15 years, of being an administrator and sort of having an inside sense of how the system works, and being able to mature as a person to the point where I'm able to sort of see what I want to do with the rest of the time I have, and the perspective is different. And it does take time to develop skills, not just when you work in producing videos or podcasts or things, it takes time to learn those skills to produce that content in a way that is of a quality that people, respond to. And you're not taught any of that in your ordinary academic
No, no.
education. So that's got to take time to mature too.
Maybe this is a new course for you to teach. Before I end up giving you more work, Kevin, let me flash up another question. And this is from Tyler Youngers, who actually has several questions. So let me just bring this up. Where do you find your content? Is it OER? What's your research base?
I find my content. I produce my content. I don't find it, right? But
So it's entirely your own stuff, entirely your own creation.
well, nothing's entirely anyone's own stuff.
In
But
terms of
but
copyright, though.
I'll give you an example. So if I'm doing the content that I was doing based on stuff I was teaching, for example, in my basic critical thinking class, well,
Mhm.
I have a shelf with probably 35 critical thinking textbooks on this shelf right over there, and they go way back. So there's tons of content that is repeated and processed and taught in different ways. And so if the job was there was like, I want to teach this particular well-trodden concept in my own way, then there's tons of things I can draw upon to sort of, ground what I'm doing. It's a judgment call about how I frame it and what points I want to emphasize or not, and then there's the modality of presenting it. You use cartoons or videos or slides or whatever podcast. But there's other stuff I do which is more original. Like for example, in the podcast I'm working on now is this question about critical thinking about complex social phenomena, like why is the country as polarized as it is right now? What's the source of the animosity? What's the
Okay.
um, um, you take that as a topic, and people, it's heated, part of our political culture of the day. People claiming that we're experiencing kind of a crisis of tribal thinking and polarization.
Right.
Well, that for me is like I'm a philosopher of science by training, and this is a philosophy of social science
Mm,
problem.
mm,
Um, and it has a direct relevant to critical thinking because people will often say that in the heat of one's our tribal identities make us impassioned about topics, but also narrow and blinker our thinking, and make us prone to cognitive biases of various kinds, make us prone to exaggerate differences between groups, make us prone to not see the weaknesses in our own thinking, so on. So here's a topic that's relevant to critical thinking as a domain, as a topic, and I should know more about that. And so when I do that, this is a research project, just as if I was a grad student or if I was writing a paper. I do research. I read. I have um, um, research files and folders. I do summaries and notes to myself. I try to make sure I'm going as broad as possible. Um, and just as you would with any research program, and then you develop a line of thought and you explore it and you start to write. And so in that respect, the work that I'm doing there, the kind of creative work, is very similar to academic work that I would have been doing, that any academic does when they're trying to get their head around a set of ideas or a problem.
I see what you
Uh,
mean. I see what you mean.
right?
That's a Tyler. That's a really great probe of a question, and I love the way, Kevin, this just takes you another cut through all of your work. Um, we have another question, and friends, we're down to about 12 minutes before the end, maybe 10 minutes. So this is the time to start asking. Kisa has a follow-up question, which is again content related, which is: are there metaphysical elements present in your philosophy and approach to teaching and learning?
Well, if you were here, I would probably want to know what you meant by metaphysical elements.
Well, Kisa
Um,
can definitely follow up if her
but
camera is working. I'll let you know. But if not, she can follow up with another text response.
I could say, if you want to type in some kind of clarification there, but I can say that, is there do I bring I mean, there are people who bring a strong philosophical, ideological orientation to teaching. You can often tell, just if you have a teacher like this, every class sort of, you are reminded of the type of thinker they are, the type of commitments they have. But others, it's kind of mysterious, right? You often don't know whether your teacher is Republican or conservative or liberal or what, whether they're religious or not. You don't really know necessarily,
Right.
and they're hiding that part, on purpose, partly because they don't want the focus. They don't think that the content. They want to separate the content that they're teaching and the analysis of what they're doing from what their political or philosophical or religious orientation is. Um, and I have a set, but I think I'm also of that camp who is not interested in talking much about philosophical viewpoints that are really just kind of speculative for me. I have to say, I'm a bit of a skeptic. I'm attracted to skepticism about deep philosophical topics. So the answer, I don't know.
Huh.
Oh, there you are. Hello.
Roger Lord.
Oh, yeah. So for me, because I have to look at like where I stand in this space, in this world, and like who I am. And a lot of times, because I'm a Black woman, I have to stand in between the truth and reality, like all the time. Like I don't have the choice to be like, oh, this is this and this is that, and my mistakes aren't discounted on me. So I live between truth and reality, and a lot of times that lies in very metaphysical spaces, versus in the cognition space so much, all the time, because I have to figure out my truth within these systems that are created on a lot, like all the systems that we live upon is created on race, which is not real. It's not reality. But yet a lot of our systems are based upon that race structure, which isn't real. And so I say that a lot of times, like I look at things from a metaphysical space because I have to stand in between my truth and my reality in this space that we live in. And a lot of times when we're studying or we're in school, those spaces aren't like really honored in that space.
Mhm.
Like like, why is something this way? They tend to want to stay in the cognition space, and then they'll get a little meta cognition. And I'm like, no, no, no. What about the things that you can't see? You can't, like, it's more multimodal nodal than most. Like, it's something that you got to taste, breathe, and see and be, and you become. It's not just something I like retrieve from my memory all the time. It's not something I just write down. I am and I've become it in a way. And so like so I'm wondering, because I hear some things from you that you're not saying, that I feel like sometimes like you do have a metaphysical presence about like how you look at some things, but it seems like you don't want to go there. And I understand why, because I mean, we're in academia and a lot of people don't look at the metaphysical space as a space to be in a lot of times.
I'll tell you two things. I'll respond to two things that I'm picking up from. One is the sense that being agnostic about important philosophical or religious or political views is a privilege that not everyone enjoys. Being agnostic is where you can say, I don't know what's right or wrong about this, but I'll consider the arguments pro and con whatsoever. When in fact, when you step outside the door, you are confronted with a reality in which one side or the other of these issues has an impact on people's lives.
Okay.
And so it's not a purely academic issue, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that this is a big part of my orientation about these things, is that there's the difference between the real world, where there's a lot of sort of complex social forces acting on us all the time. These issues are pressing and really important to us. And then there's the space that we want to, when we want to be able to close ourselves off from that world and join a group of people and say, I want to talk about this, but in this space here where we can sort of have some rules for conversation that will let us say things that are really hard to say outside in the public space. It seems like those are valuable spaces to create, right? Create spaces where there's the norms and expectations of conversation and dialogue are such that it's okay, it's safe to talk about, to raise an issue and respond to an issue, which you might get your head chopped off in the room down the hallway. But here, it doesn't work that way. Now, this is an experience that I often had as a teacher in a philosophy department, where part of our amazing thing that is done is you can have these conversations in these classroom environments about ethical issues or political issues that are topics that would otherwise be very hard to get people to think objectively about, as it were, or about canvassing views pro and con on things that where deep down they really are not. They have a very strong orientation. But in these spaces, it seems okay to do. It seems natural and normal to have those conversations in this way. And so I'm very interested in how these sort of social spaces that reinforce a certain kind of productive conversation that stays within sort of boundaries are possible, because that's where the best philosophical reasoning gets done. That's where the best scientific reasoning gets done. Now, the mistake is thinking that when you set up those spaces, those are a social achievement. They're not to be taken for granted. So the mistake that students often make is they go home, or they leave the classroom in which it was okay to talk about this, and they move into a new environment and they say the same things they said back there, and they get their head cut off, right? They get jumped on, they get yelled at, they make people angry. And it's like, what's the difference? Back in my class when we had this sort of cultivated environment, it was so great. It was so enriching. We were supporting each other. And then I say the same thing out here, and I'm attacked for it. What's the difference? Well, the difference is what's possible when you create social spaces where certain norms of conversation are. It's a social achievement.
Let me
And
pause you for a second there, Kevin, because this is
sure,
a great answer. And Keith, this is a fantastic question. I want to give you both a chance to answer a question that just popped up. So let me put this on the screen because it addresses this right spot on. This is from the awesome Tom Hames, another great friend of the program, who asks, do you feel that you are freer to explore these kinds of philosophical discussions outside of the academy or less free?
both. The answer is both. I mean, I'll tell you what. I'll give you an example.
That was a good one. That was a good
Inside the academy, if I was in charge of my own class, in my own
Right.
department, I
Right.
would be able to have the freedom to sort of define the space of, I would be able to set the tone where the expectations, where you could have conversations. I mean, I did ethics classes where I drew cartoons, they're horrible cartoons, but it was part of like the ethics of what's the difference between the value of a human being and the value of an animal with respect to meat eating, using animals for food, and I won't describe the cartoon I drew, but it was provocative cartoon. I got away with it in that space, right? Because everyone understood the point that I was trying to make. I would never have posted that cartoon on Twitter because I'm not in control of the meaning of that representation. I'm not in control of the semantics of the interpretation, and that means that in those public spaces where I'm on the street, as it were, I'm not in my dojo. I'm on the street.
Right.
The rules are different, and I will get beat up for things that you can get away with in these other enclosed spaces. You have to go.
Understood. Thank you, Kisa. Oh, you're muted.
response. Thank you so much. Gave me some food for thought. I appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Kisa. Kisa's leaving, but we all have to go. I feel awful bringing this to a stop. Kevin, I can just admire your students, be they in the physical classroom with you from time to time or online, because we've covered a rich variety of ground. Let me ask two questions on the way out. Let me ask one observation, actually, and one question. The observation comes from Twitter. Wonderful Vanessa Vale shares with us the website belonging to one Laura Gibbs. Laura Gibbs is a teacher who has a site called mythfolklore.net. And on it, she puts an enormous amount, a giant archive worth of content, not just of her social media work, but also all of her coursework, which includes a ton of different materials, everything from myth, folklore, multiple regions of the world. So just look at mythfolklore.net as an example of this kind of publishing a lot of content to the web.
It looks fascinating. I'm looking at it right now. It's fantastic.
She's wonderful. Ping her on Twitter. She's a great person to know. My last question for you to ask is, where can we keep up with you the best? Is it the Critical Academy site, or is it you on Twitter, or is your Ninja podcast the best place?
Well, I wish it'd be great if like it was like 2 weeks down the road, because the answer would have been different. But I have a problem with too many websites and too many audiences that are fragmented.
Right.
So I've got the Critical Theory Academy people, I've got the Patreon people, I've got the YouTube people, I've got the podcast people. And I have my own home site, kevindeLaPlante.com, which is where right now I'm aggregating the podcast home pages, the pages for the podcast, but also blog posts and things, and also stuff I do for speaking and consulting work and things like that. But I'm in the process of aggregating all this stuff. So I've moved all of my video stuff over to the kevindeLaPlante.com site. So ultimately, within a period of time, the idea is to get rid of the Critical Thinker Academy site, get rid of the Patreon account, get rid of the argumentninja.com site, which is now redirected. But I had too many. All that content and in the sort of operational, the way it works is going to be brought under the kevindeLaPlante.com umbrella. site.
Okay.
So I've recreated all the video content as a kind of subdomain of the
Very good.
deLaPlante.com site. And there'll be a newsletter. There's going to be a new communities thing. So I've got a new Facebook group that I'll be launching for supporters at a certain level. I'm going to be I want to talk to you guys, to the Shindig people, about using Shindig as a community video platform for my like a monthly conversation with my audience.
I'm sure they'd be delighted to talk with you about this.
And yeah, but until then, you can follow the podcast. You can follow my YouTube channel. You can follow Twitter, and I'll share all the content through there eventually.
And by the end of May, it's all going to be kevindeLaPlante.com.
Well, the transitions take time. There'll be a site there, and then the effort to migrate people will take time. You can't just people have habits. You want to explain what's new in the new place and why they would want to shift, and give them. So there's got to be a lag here, but eventually it'll all be there. So I'll have one place where I can communicate with everyone. I can share new content with everyone, and we can develop a real kind of community structure there, all under one umbrella.
One site.
That's what I'm going for.
One site.
That's it.
Listen, Kevin, it's been wonderful talking with you, wonderful thinking with you, and my thanks to the forum for these really good questions. I hate to kick you up, but we're out of time. I need to introduce everybody what's happening for the next week, but I'll follow up later, and I look forward to hearing how you progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you for everyone for your questions.
Well, don't leave everyone yet. We have just news coming up. Next week, we have Gina Ann Garcia. She's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh who is the author of a brand new book on Hispanic serving institutions. So it'll be wonderful to dive into that topic with her, especially looking at a population which is the fastest growing and soon to be one of the leading populations in the United States. We're also continuing our book club reading, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. We're wading deeper and deeper into this powerful book. Discussions are crackling on the blog post as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So please join us in the book club to continue reading Zuboff's really extraordinary book. If you'd like to grab that or other books related, head to the bookstore. And if you'd like to keep our conversation going, we're all over social media. So you can join our groups in Slack, LinkedIn, or Facebook. You can follow the hashtag FTTE just about anywhere and find Shindig or myself on Twitter. In the meantime, thank you all for your excellent questions. This has been a great discussion. Look forward to seeing you all online and seeing you next week. Bye-bye.